Hello, you're watching Low Batteries, a look at video games and mental health. In this episode, I want to talk about the depiction of mental health institutions in games and why, for the most part, that depiction is counterproductive. Because the thing is, mental health institutions are pretty common settings for video games, especially horror games. Unfortunately, these institutions are almost universally presented as places of fear, danger, and horrible abuse. And part of the reason for this depiction, sadly, is historical precedent. Truth be told, mental health institutions haven't always been forces for good. The most infamous example is probably Bedlam or Bethlem, which is a foreshortening of Bethlehem Hospital. Founded in England in the 13th century, Bedlam started operating specifically as a facility for the mentally ill from around 1460. Treatments could be pretty brutal. Corporal punishment and hydrotherapy were common, as was solitary confinement, designed to help patients come to their senses. At one point, manacles, chains and stocks were all listed as part of the hospital inventory. Bethlehem Hospital still operates to this day and is now drastically different, but in those days before proper psychiatric care, that Bedlam was essentially a place where the mentally ill were locked away, not treated. There's also the Volterra, an abandoned institution in Tuscany, Italy, which closed in 1976, when it and other institutions like it nationwide were ordered to shut down and give patients their civil rights. The Volterra was famous for its use of electroshock therapy. Patients were often tied to beds and were frequently denied access to letters from friends and loved ones. The Volterra is the setting for psychological horror game Town of Light, which we'll be coming back to shortly. For the moment, however, I just want to make it abundantly clear that facilities like these are a far cry from modern psychiatric units. Now, mental health asylums, as we used to understand them, are tempting places to set video games. I can readily accept that. They were dark, cruel, miserable places. The barbarism of the treatments, combined with the operators' proud, hard-headed insistence they were doing the right thing, to produce a really evocative, almost eldritch atmosphere. There's something about how inhuman these institutions were that captures some dark part of the imagination, even now. And it's not hard to imagine how game makers might be inspired to create experiences reflecting that brooding horror. Both typically and unfortunately, however, video games depicting mental health institutions tend to make two big mistakes. Firstly, they don't make a clear enough distinction between outmoded mental health asylums and modern psychiatric wards, but most harmfully of all, they take these places, which we've already established were tremendous sources of dread and fear for the people held there, but they make the patients themselves the source of the horror instead. Let's talk about Outlast. Outlast is a game in which you play as an investigative journalist who breaks into a dilapidated asylum, hoping to discover what went on there. Once you get in, armed only with your wits and your video camera, you quickly realise that all is not well at Mount Massive. In fact, as it turns out, the inmates are running the asylum. While a smattering of the supernatural is mixed in with the plot, the vast majority of the game is spent avoiding dangerous inmates who are trying to catch and kill you, because that's what they're like, you know. It's a pretty lazy way of showing off institutions, for one thing, but it's also exploitative. The fear generated by the asylum setting hinges on a sense of the unstable or unpredictable, a sense of otherness attached to mental health sufferers. In other words, it tells us this asylum is scary because the patients within it are dangerous and they're not locked away safely like they ought to be. And that's annoying, because personally I don't think the asylum setting really adds very much to Outlast, and it wouldn't have taken much effort to avoid the reductive depiction of the mentally ill. See, the reason you go to Mount Massive in the first place is because you get a tip that unethical experiments are being conducted there. Now, that's something that could conceivably be happening anywhere. The people being experimented on could have been kidnapped, for instance, or they could have been duped into going along with these experiments, at least initially, possibly as part of a cult, or hey, any one of 1,000 ruses. Instead, it takes place in an asylum, and the idea of bad people doing bad things to vulnerable people is thrown out of the window in favour of scary mentally ill people scaring the player because mentally ill people. I'm not trying to be censorious here, I actually had a great time playing Outlast when it first came out. It's a really scary game, but it's also kind of alienating. If I tell someone I'm mentally ill, I don't want them worrying about whether or not it's safe to be around me because they once got chased around the video game hospital by a character going oogie boogie boogie. But then, not all video games featuring mental institutions are quite so blasé about the whole thing. Some try to engage with asylums and psychiatric hospitals in a more considered and meaningful manner. As I mentioned earlier, Town of Light is set in the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra, a now derelict building that was once home to 6,000 mental health patients. Town of Light attempts to highlight the cruelty of the Volterra and the treatments it used to inflict on people, while also showing what life can be like for mental health sufferers. Comparing the game to photographs of the building as it is now, it's clear they've done a fantastic job of recreating the hospital itself. In terms of the game's message, however, they weren't nearly as successful.
They put a straitjacket on you. They gave you a cold shower.
Town of Light spends a great deal of time generating sympathy for the main character Renee, who was a patient in the Volterra from a young age. Toward the end of the game, however, the story starts to play with how reliable she is as a narrator, causing her to question whether she was imagining events, feelings, even entire friendships. Ultimately, you're forced to consult the hospital records to find the truth, meaning the only truly reliable narrator in the entire game is the barbaric institution itself, the very thing the game is trying to paint as cruel and unnecessary. After spending so long making you feel a sense of injustice at Renee being kept in this horrible place, it suddenly gets you questioning whether maybe that's where she belonged after all. In this way, Town of Light ends up validating an institution that subjects its patients to electroshock therapy, ice pick lobotomies, physical restraints, neglect, and even sexual assault. While I don't doubt it was developed with good intentions, the confused narrative of Town of Light ends up completely bottoming out. It tries to tell a story about a woman who is failed by the institution into which she is committed, but sadly it ends up failing her instead. There are also a few scenes in which you wake up in a room full of patients and immediately start hyperventilating fearfully. While it never shows any of these people acting violently, it still reinforces the idea that this is a room in which one should be fearful, because it's full of mental patients. From Outlast setting, to Manhunt 2's murderous protagonist being an escaped mental patient, to Far Cry 3's Vars being dangerous and unpredictable because he's capital I insane, the depiction of mental health sufferers and mental health institutions is so often reductive that it's genuinely quite difficult to find examples in which these places are portrayed well. And just so we're clear here, by well, I am willing to accept anything that isn't painfully simplistic or exploitative.
Welcome to the madhouse, Batman!
Batman Arkham Asylum, for instance, so nearly gets there. It is set in an asylum for the criminally insane, but neatly sidesteps having Batman beat up a bunch of mentally ill people by packing the place out with ordinary criminals instead. See, before Arkham Asylum starts, there's a big fire at Blackgate Prison, requiring the inmates to be temporarily housed in Arkham, which they then take over. See? Easy. Set in an asylum, not exploiting the mentally ill. Until, that is, Arkham Asylum drops the ball right through the floor by introducing the howling, animalistic enemies called lunatics, at which point Batman dutifully punches them in the head as well. The Darkness 2, despite being honestly a bit of a surprising addition to this list, actually does an okay job. The patients, unfortunately, are depicted in a pretty cartoonish way, but the psychiatric hospital section genuinely does project an impression of a fully functioning facility. While wandering around, it's not too big a stretch of the imagination to picture people getting cared for here. Similarly, Wolfenstein the New Order shows you a psychiatric hospital in which the staff clearly care very deeply about the well-being of their patients. It's a really positive depiction, it's just sad that it only lasts for 45 seconds before the Nazis turn up and start shooting people, basically using the laudably progressive depiction as a way to undermine how bad the bad guys are. Those are the most positive examples I was able to come up with, but if you have any of your own, I would really love to hear them either in the comments or on Twitter. Now, as we start to wrap up this episode, I just want to underline the fact that I am not trying to censor any video games here. I don't think games like Outlast should be banned, or that their creators ought to apologise, really. Truth be told, I don't think I've ever been outright offended by a depiction of mental health in a video game. What I do feel, though, is tired and bored. Seeing mental health depicted in such reductive terms promotes the most incredible sense of fatigue, because it's lazy and it's perpetuating some stupid preconceptions about what you can expect from the mentally ill. Reinforcing the idea the mentally ill are a threat to our safety only helps to keep mental health stigma alive, and I'm forced to ask, when you're setting a game in an asylum to scare people, then ignoring the institution itself to make villains out of its patients instead, is it really worth it? As ever, if you think you or someone you know might be suffering, don't carry on in silence. You can find links to a whole bunch of mental health resources in the description of this video. And if you want to see more episodes of Low Batteries, we've got you covered. I took a look at the portrayal of PTSD in Spec Ops: The Line, for instance. There's also an episode on coping strategies for people suffering from anxiety, and one on how depression can relate to video games. Have a look if you're interested. Either way, thanks for watching, and take care.